Well guys, we did it. We made it to the end of 2019. It is now time to get reflective on what the best albums were over the last 353 days. Now, if I'm being honest, I wasn't really keeping up with new releases as closely this year as I have been for the past few years, probably because I started this YouTube channel and wanted to make content that was more retrospective rather than just reviewing new releases, hence me not quite being as active on the Instagram page. That being said though, here's like 5 or 10 or, okay, 15 honorable mentions. That should be enough. I'd like to get back into the swing of things in 2020, but we'll see what happens. For those of you who don't know me though, or couldn't give any less of a fuck, here it is, my top 15 favorite albums of 2019. Eric Andre is one of my favorite people in popular media. It's amazing we have a figure as eccentric and outside the norm as him in the mainstream, and if I were to make a list of the top 3 funniest things ever, then the Eric Andre show would certainly be on there. He's dabbled in making music before, but it was pretty much nothing more than a novel attempt at experimental hip-hop. He actually graduated from Berklee College of Music as a violinist, believe it or not, so this record is high art. Despite the way Eric describes this album in interviews and live performances,
it's unlistenable, too. It's fucking unlistenable. I dare you to get through like 6 minutes of my album.
This feels like his first shot at serious experimental music, especially considering he put it out on Stone's Throw. Yes, that Stone's Throw. It's an entirely sample-based album, taking sounds from older songs, TV jingles, and real-world noises, wrapped up in a pretty tight 28 minutes. Pretty much all of the absurdity and abstraction in the Eric Andre show translates into music pretty seamlessly, making for an unpredictable and fun experience. There's even a 12-minute noise song on here in the middle of the record called I Worship Satan. And yeah, that's why this album isn't higher. Look, it's not the worst noise song ever, but it's far from the best. It really could have benefited from having more texture and just a more clear progression overall, as it's really only entertaining for the first couple minutes or so. Still though, the rest of this album is excellent, and certainly one of the most interesting and memorable music experiences I had in 2019. Not gonna front, I'm really not the biggest metalhead in the world. I have a deep appreciation for metal and its many subgenres, but I don't really follow new metal releases as closely as I do hip-hop or albums in the indie sphere. With that in mind, you can take it with a grain of salt when I say that 2019 is probably the strongest year for metal that we've had in a long time, at least that I've noticed. Pretty much every month there was at least a few records in the genre that caught my attention, and many of them stuck with me throughout the year, including the 4th album from UK black metal band Saor. This band is known for taking black metal and fusing it with the instrumentation of Celtic folk music. You can expect to hear a lot of violins, acoustic guitars, and pianos alongside heavy guitars and growling vocals. Their newest album, Forgotten Paths, consists of 4 tracks that have some of the most memorable playing and solid performances I heard all year. Highly recommend to any fan of the genre, unless you're one of those black metal old heads who hates anything that doesn't sound like it was recorded using the N64's microphone peripheral.
Fill my face, oh God. SMH, no ASMR.
Ever since I heard Veteran back in early 2018, JPEGMAFIA is one of those artists who I wanted to like a lot more than I did. I appreciate him for his contributions to underground hip-hop, as I feel no other rapper truly exemplifies internet rap in the same way that he did on that record. It truly feels like the rap album equivalent of scrolling through some random online message board, but you know what comes with that? Shit posting. Yeah, a lot of time on Veteran was spent with these instrumental passages that just didn't progress into much of anything. I know that was probably the point, but I just didn't find them interesting enough to justify their place on a 19-track, 50-minute album. I was hoping my issues with this project would be alleviated on his follow-up, and surely enough, this is the Peggy album that I wanted. It's full of all the same humor and experimentation that fueled Veteran, but in a more digestible package. There's a really strong knack for melody and production that manages to be as bold and unconventional as Veteran while being a lot more polished. While Peggy's constant references to internet culture may ultimately date this album and really most of his work in the long run, I feel like he's doing a lot to push hip-hop forward into the next decade, and I still see nothing but improvement going forward. Not much else left to say, but damn, Peggy! Speaking of great black metal that strays from the standard formula, Liturgy came back this year, with maybe their best album so far. These guys have always been a bit polarizing, with their fusions of math rock, black metal, and noise not always landing for people, especially on their previous album, The Artwork, which began to incorporate elements of electronic music and even a bit of post-metal. This new album sees the band taking what they tried on that one and going the extra mile, seamlessly integrating glitch music and more stripped-back and upbeat instrument sections into compositions that you'd really think weren't made for it. I can't really say that I've heard the unconventional rhythms of glitch put into an extreme metal context in a way that was as well executed as it is here. The music is as unforgiving as it is graceful, and when paired with the shrieking and shrill vocal performances, makes for one of the most unique experiences I've had with the genre in 2019.
Eye contact with Pikachu's or money cats.
And I remember a time.
Gareth Littard and Fiona Kishin of Drones fame have returned with a new musical project that's as entertaining and off the wall as you'd expect from a band called Tropical Storm. If you're unfamiliar with the Drones, their music kinda sounds like an angry Australian guy ranting to you at a blues bar. Contrary to their name, they don't play drone music, but if you want to hear more about drone music, you can check out this video. I'm sorry, I had to. This is the second album they've released under this moniker, and a big step forward from their debut, which was already pretty great. They sound like a more unfiltered and explosive version of the band they originated from, incorporating bigger build-ups and even more sarcastic vocal delivery. Gareth's abstract and hilariously cynical lyrics are complemented perfectly by the chaotic yet somewhat relaxing instrumentation. His voice is well contrasted by Fiona's, who has such a weird voice that I can only describe it as an Australian Fever Ray. They're one of the most exciting bands out right now doing what they are, and you're going to want to keep a lookout for them in years to come. Cracking the top 10, we have Full of Hell, a band that I usually find more interesting on their collaborative projects, like the one they did with Merzbow, for example. By themselves, they come across as kind of a run-in-the-mill grind group, even down to their name, but damn, they really killed it on Weeping Choir. This thing is an abrasive yet catchy fusion of grindcore, death metal, and noise that I found myself returning to a lot this year. The shorter and more explosive cuts play off of the more long-winded tracks and noise pieces really nicely, and everything from the vocal performances, guitar work, and drumming feels carefully planned, yet still as rough and disgusting as grind is supposed to be. Also, Thundering Hammers is maybe the only song I've heard in the genre that I can recall legitimately having a hook, and yet it still got stuck in my head. One of the best albums I've heard in the genre in a long time, and that I'd highly recommend checking out.
How did you get so perfect? I wish that I was perfect.
A few months back I made a video about Drain Gang, which by the way, holy shit! But about a month after I made that video, one of the key members dropped his official debut, so now my video is dated and terrible. Fortunately though, I can talk about it here because it's a pretty excellent record. It looks like this is the most widely acclaimed project dropped by the collective thus far, which makes sense considering Echo's style is a bit more accessible than Blade and Tyboy for his smoother vocals and laid-back production. That doesn't take away from the drainage that this project has to offer though. In fact, this thing sounds even more like a cry for help amidst drug addiction and existentialism than maybe anything the group's dropped yet. Echo nonchalantly delivers some of the saddest lyrics I've heard this year, and the way he switches up the pitch of his voice from track to track makes the whole thing feel like we're traveling down this dark spiral with him. This is all complemented by production that's as strange as it is smooth, just as Echo's voice. I've been listening to it a lot since it came out, and I could easily see it growing on me even further as time goes on. In fact, probably the only reason it isn't higher is because I haven't had quite as much time to digest it, and I feel like there's so many layers that I've yet to understand and fully appreciate. Either way though, the album did a great job of meeting my expectations, and I hope to hear this group continue to evolve in the future. This Japanese math rock and post-hardcore band returns for their second full-length album. I use the term full-length pretty loosely, as this thing is only 7 tracks and barely over 20 minutes, following in the footsteps of their previous album Trial 1, which is easily some of the best music I've ever heard in this style. I'd seriously give it my highest recommendation to any music fan, assuming you're not bothered by the language barrier, unless you can translate these lyrics for me, in which case that would be excellent. While I don't quite love this one as much as its predecessor, I'm happy to see the band evolve and try new things. This album carries much more influence from post-rock and just straight indie. The instrumental palette is much broader, with some beautiful pianos and even synths worked in on some of these cuts. It feels so much larger and epic in its compositions than anything the group's dropped yet, and combined with their established songwriting talents, makes for a pretty immaculate indie record. I really want more people to check out this band because they are severely, severely underrated, and I really can't get enough of them. Speaking of emotional DIY rock records, this Swedish artist came up pretty much out of nowhere to bring one of the most talked about and acclaimed lo-fi albums of the year, and for good reason. I heard this thing was entirely recorded using an Apple earbud microphone, just like my videos. While I couldn't find any sources to prove how accurate this was, it wouldn't surprise me if that was the case. The mixing on this album is rough, and some of the songs feel like they don't even have mixing at all, yet the record came out sounding so immaculate. All of the chaotic playing and vocals that are sometimes very audible and other times buried come together into a very emotional experience. The vocals on this album are all performed by one person, and their vocal range borders the line between deep and masculine and high and feminine, sometimes even switching between the two. Combined with the many lyrics involving heartbreak and trying to fit into society, it comes across as a powerful statement on the struggles with gender identity. The stories told on this album are descriptive enough to be interesting, but are vague enough to be just as shrouded in mystery as the artist themselves. It's like a concept album where the character names are only communicated via track titles and are only referred to as pronouns throughout the actual lyrics, which does a lot to play into the album's themes. It's a very interesting and powerful listen, and one that musically feels like a big step forward for the DIY indie scene on Bandcamp. The music is ambitious, but doesn't compromise its homemade quality for being grandiose. Fantastic record, give it a shot. Show Me the Body is a band that blew up off of having some strange genre fusions, combining the basis of noise rock and hardcore punk with the rising trend of industrial hip-hop. In other words, this generation's answer to rap rock. Now I know that isn't the most well-liked genre in the world, but these guys presented it in a way that was actually pretty interesting on both the debut and their 2017 project, which featured a rapper on pretty much every track, some of which are big names now, like Denzel Curry and Princess Nokia. They've returned this year with a new album that pretty much abandons everything that made them unique before, gone are the hip-hop and even most of the industrial elements that they were working with. Usually when a band does this, it's a bad thing, as it makes them stand out less among their contemporaries. But somehow, Show Me the Body pulled through with easily their strongest record yet. This is one of the most well-written, catchy, and raw punk albums I've heard all decade. The lyrics that tackle modern-day social issues and memorable riffs and vocal melodies make it feel like an album ripped straight out of the golden age of hardcore, but for a new generation. Easily a must-listen for any punk fan, and one that has remained a favorite of mine since it came out very early in the year. While I'm not the biggest Beyonce fan in the world, as you can maybe tell based on much of my music taste, this live album is absolutely incredible. It's a huge performance that recontextualizes Beyonce's entire career, even spanning back to Destiny's Child. All of her big songs, which there are quite a lot of, are put into this grandiose performance with huge and elaborate brass and percussion sections. It was accompanied by a movie on Netflix that shows the concert in its entirety alongside anecdotal bits about how it all came together. This is easily Beyonce's magnum opus and feels like the passion project she's wanted to make throughout her entire career. Also, how many artists even have the budget, recognition, and experience accumulated over several decades to even attempt a performance like this? Certainly not Coldplay! I think that decades from now, this project will be looked back upon as Beyonce's most celebrated album, akin to artists like Johnny Cash and Fishmans. It's easily one of the best live albums of the decade, and I really can't see why anyone would hate on it unless they have some sort of biased spite towards Beyonce for whatever reason. Even some of her songs that I didn't care for, like Diva and Partition, sound absolutely excellent in context of this performance. But not Mi Gente, that song still sucks. Maybe it's just the fact that I've played in a marching band for years, so I have a soft spot for the way she redoes these songs, but even that aside, I find a lot of her performances to be more dynamic and engaging than their studio counterparts. It's near perfect for what it is, and something I doubt any artist is going to top anytime soon as far as live performances go. I know I only gave this album a 7 when I initially reviewed it, but it's grown on me quite a bit as the year's gone on. I also know that the music on here isn't technically from this year, as it's somewhat of a best-of compilation disguised as an album, but this artist deserves more attention, damn it. As you guys know, I'm a pretty big Drain Gang fan, and this sounds like it could have been recorded by a long-lost member of the group. Mixed Matches performs in a softly spoken manner that becomes extremely alien when paired with the vocal effects. It plays off of the futuristic and cloudy production to make some of the most gratifying music in the cloud rap genre so far. In fact, if we lived in a parallel universe where this was a Drain album, then this would easily be in my top 3 from the entire collective. It's a tight 9 tracks that are also instantly catchy and intoxicating and became one of my go-tos for nighttime drives. While this artist is yet to really gain a big audience, he's been getting talked about more and more as the year's gone on, so I could easily see a bigger following for Mixed Matches in the near future. Maybe some of you watching could become part of that following as well by listening to this album, because it's really good. Members of metal bands Atami Kaila, Dark Buddha Rising, and Orsani Pazuzu, god that's fun to say, formed an underground supergroup earlier this year called Waste of Space Orchestra. The music on this album is rooted in much of the sludge and black metal tinged sounds that these groups are known for making, but with strong influences of doom and prog metal. The album juxtaposes its heavy and sludgy guitars with these otherworldly synths and vocal performances that are strange, but still fit into the heavy context of what the group is doing. It feels like I'm watching some type of epic sci-fi battle of man versus machine, as the guitars and synths are just at war with each other, with the vocalist being the commander of an army. I sit back in awe and watch this gruesome but beautiful battle unfold. Do I sound like Patrick Bateman yet? Anyway, if that sounds interesting to you, then give this thing a shot.
My spotty 60s got me on the fences.
Yeah, original choice, I know, but damn, Tyler Tyler absolutely killed it on this thing. It's an interesting concept album about a love triangle and Tyler's personal struggles, but one that doesn't entirely reveal itself after your first handful of listens. Not because it's poorly written or anything like that, but because the music on this album is just so well assembled and blissful that it's easy to get caught up into just how great it sounds. It's a culmination of everything Tyler's been doing for the past few years, from his distinct and cartoonish approach to beat making to his raspy but dynamic vocal performances. Despite this though, it stands entirely on its own in the Tyler catalog, being his most conceptual, cohesive, and refined album so far. It's also his biggest departure from hip-hop yet, as he doubles down on his soul influences to make a sound that's retro, yet so far ahead of nearly all of his contemporaries. There's not a moment on the entire album that feels wasted or unfitting to the narrative, and yet all of these songs can be easily enjoyed on their own. It makes me so happy knowing that the first ever album to reach #1 on Billboard's Top 200 Albums chart by a solo rapper that was entirely produced and arranged by one person is such a brilliant and personal record. It's amazing to have a figure as forward-thinking and creative as Tyler in the mainstream, and given both the commercial and critical reception of this album, it has potential to go down as a modern classic, even though I still prefer Flower Boy a little bit. Yeah, if you follow my Instagram page, then first of all, thank you, and second, you probably knew this had to be #1, but I mean, it really couldn't have been anything else. This is kind of a difficult album to talk about, as the subject matter is very heavy, and so is the way it's communicated. It portrays the impenetrable darkness of the human psyche that arises in abusive relationships, and is maybe the best album dedicated to the topic that I've ever heard. Musically, it's a continuation of the exciting but niche sounds of artists like Dead Can Dance and Diamanda Gallis, who fuse the darker side of post-punk, new wave, and gothic rock with the linear compositions of Western classical music. As a result, I really can't label this album as anything other than this monstrosity of a genre tag right here. Hater takes influence from these artists, but creates a sound that's huge and biblical, from her densely layered vocal harmonies to her giant backing instrumentation. The album ranges from being absolutely gorgeous to having some of the most abrasive and harsh sounds I've heard all year. This balance of moods does a lot to communicate the internal struggle that goes through one's psyche in the situations the hater talks about, illustrating the damage, but also why it's so difficult to get out of abusive relationships. It's taken to a biblical extreme and feels like a battle of good and evil blown to the proportion that's as big as it can be inside of a victim's head. Every song plays off of each other to communicate this brilliantly, with perfect performances, excellent songwriting, and uncommon soundscapes. It's an unforgettable journey of a record that'll likely stick with you for years if you decide to listen. Well, that was my list. Hopefully it wasn't too insufferable. Let me know what some of your favorite albums of the year were in the comments, because I know I missed a lot and I'm always looking for more recommendations. If you liked the video, you know the drill, and here's to a great 2020. Wait, 2020? Oh yeah, that's right, it's the end of the decade. Top 108 albums of the decade coming right up!
2 + 2 = 4, 4 + 4 =